When I think back to that summer, I can almost taste the air, thick with honeysuckle and something unspoken. I was 19, home from my first year of college, trying to remember who I was supposed to be. My parents had left for a work trip overseas, their excitement spilling through rushed hugs and half-packed suitcases. They promised to call, to check in, to make sure I didn't burn the house down or forget to eat. What they didn't realize was that their absence would leave room for something else entirely, something that would haunt me long after the summer ended. That's when my Uncle Drew moved in, Mom's younger brother. I'd met him a handful of times growing up, mostly at family holidays. Always a charming one who showed up late, but somehow made everyone forget him the moment he smiled. He'd been living out west for years, and no one really talked about why he'd suddenly come back. My mother said he needed a change of pace. My father just said, keep an eye on him. When he arrived, the first thing I noticed wasn't his grin. It was the quiet. He stood in the doorway, duffel bag in hand, eyes scanning the house like it used to belong to someone else. He looked older than I remembered, the kind of tired that doesn't come from work, but from something heavier. Still, when he saw me, he smiled. Rowan, right? You've gotten tall. His voice had this warmth to it, deep but careful, like he was testing the weight of every word. I didn't know what to say, so I just laughed and helped him with his bags. That first night, we ate leftovers in the kitchen under the dim yellow light. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Over the next few days, Drew settled into a rhythm. He'd wake early, make strong coffee, and sit on the porch staring at the lake. Sometimes he'd whistle softly, some tune I never recognized. I'd find myself joining him, my own mug in hand, not saying much. I started to notice little things. The way he'd run his thumb along the edge of his cup when he was thinking, the faint scar on his jaw that looked like a question mark. It didn't take long before we began talking. At first, it was small things, weather, old movies, the way the town hadn't changed. But then, one afternoon while helping him fix a screen door, he asked if college felt like freedom. I told him it didn't, that it felt more like pretending. He chuckled softly, tightening a screw. That feeling doesn't go away, kid. You just get better at pretending. There was something in his tone that made me stop. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched him work, the muscles in his forearms moving under the sunlight, his focus almost meditative. He seemed like a man always running from a thought he couldn't outrun. The days drifted quietly, like the lake itself, slow, reflective, a little too still. Sometimes we'd drive into town for groceries. He'd play old songs on the radio and tap the steering wheel like he knew each beat by heart. Other times, we'd grill by the backyard, the smell of smoke curling to the trees. He told stories then about places he'd been, people he'd met. But there was always a gap in his stories, a moment where his voice would fade and his eyes would wander. One evening, just before sunset, he asked if I wanted to help him with the boat tied near the dock. The air was heavy and gold, the kind of light that makes everything feel cinematic. I followed him, holding the rope as he adjusted the motor. He told me about fishing with my grandfather, about how he hadn't been back here since the old man's funeral. His voice grew softer, thinner. I could tell being back meant more than he let on. When we finished, we sat on the dock with our legs dangling above the water. The lake shimmered, catching the last of the light. Drew handed me a soda, took one for himself, and said, "You know, when I was your age, I thought life would make more sense by now." He laughed at the end, but it sounded hollow. I didn't know why, but I wanted to say something that mattered. "Maybe it's not supposed to make sense," I said quietly. "Maybe we're just supposed to keep figuring it out until we don't have to anymore." He turned to me then, really looked at me. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. There was something in his eyes, a mix of recognition and restraint, like he saw something in me he didn't expect. We sat there until the sky turned from gold to gray. The conversation faded, replaced by the sound of crickets and water lapping against wood. When he finally stood, he said, "You think too much, kid, but that's not always a bad thing." Then he smiled, that small, tired smile that stayed with me long after he walked back to the house. That night, Lie in bed, I kept replaying that moment by the lake. The way his voice softened, the way the air seemed to hold its breath between us. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But something inside me disagreed. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was something more confusing. Something that felt like finding a piece of yourself in someone you weren't supposed to. Over the next few days, I started noticing details I'd missed before. The way his hand brushed mine when we passed each other a cup. The quiet hum he made while washing dishes. The faint scent of cedar and aftershave that lingered in the hallway after he walked by. None of it meant anything, I told myself, but my heartbeat disagreed every time. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled in without warning. We stood by the window, watching the sky split open. Lightning flashed across the water and he laughed. This full, unguarded laugh I'd never heard from him before. For a second, it made me forget how strange everything felt. We stayed there just watching, both pretending that the silence between us was comfortable. When the storm finally eased, he said, "You know, I forgot how quiet this place gets after the rain." His voice was soft, thoughtful. I nodded, unable to say much. He looked at me for a moment, then added, "It's almost too easy to think out here." That night, I couldn't sleep. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and the house creaked with the kind of silence that makes your thoughts louder. I thought about his words, his look, that fleeting connection by the lake. Something was shifting between us, something fragile and uncertain. I didn't know it then, but that summer would carve itself into me like a secret. The kind you don't mean to keep, but somehow never find the courage to tell. And as I finally drifted into sleep, I had no idea that what had begun as quiet understanding would soon become the hardest truth I'd ever have to face. The days began to melt together after that storm, slow and warm and strangely heavy. The silence in the house no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. Drew had always been quiet, but now there was something else beneath it, something I couldn't name. We both tried to act normal, but the air between us kept catching on things unsaid. Mornings were the hardest. I'd walk into the kitchen and find him already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He'd nod, offer a faint smile, and ask how I slept. Always the same small talk, but there was a weight behind every glance, a hesitation in every word. I could feel it. He could too. One morning, while slicing fruit for breakfast, I accidentally cut my finger. It wasn't deep, but the sight of blood startled me. Drew stepped forward quickly, his hand catching mine. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. The warmth of his hand around mine sent a flicker through my chest. I nodded, unable to answer. He held on a second too long before realizing it, then stepped back, clearing his throat. "Be careful next time." The moment passed, but the awareness didn't. From then on, every shared space, every moment, felt charged with something fragile. We didn't touch again, but the memory of that touch stayed, like an echo neither of us could silence. He started inviting me along on errands. Sometimes we'd drive to town to pick up supplies, or take the old truck out to the trails near the edge of the forest. He said he liked the company, but I wasn't sure if he was trying to distract himself or me. The drives were quiet, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of wind pushing through the open windows. One afternoon, we stopped at a gas station outside town. He went inside to grab something, and I stayed in the truck, staring at my reflection in the side mirror. My face looked different somehow, older, or maybe just more aware. When he came back, he tossed a bottle of iced tea toward me. "Don't look so serious," he said, grinning. "You're 19. The world hasn't beaten you up yet." I smiled, but something inside me whispered that he was wrong. That evening, the sky turned a deep orange, fading into violet. Drew set up a small grill in the backyard, and we cooked dinner together. He told me about his time living in Oregon, how he tried to start over, how things had fallen apart. I asked why he'd left. He shrugged. "Sometimes you realize you were building a life around the wrong person," he said. "And when it breaks, you don't just lose them, you lose the version of yourself you were with them." His words stayed with me long after. I wanted to ask if that person still meant something to him, but I didn't. I was afraid of what he might say. After dinner, He suggested we take a walk down to the dock. The night was warm, the air thick with the smell of wet grass. We sat at the edge of the water, the moonlight shimmering across the lake. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "You ever feel like you're two people? The one everyone sees and the one you actually are?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Yeah," I finally said, "but I think most people just pretend they're the same person and hope no one notices a difference." He laughed softly, then looked at me, his face half lit by the moon. "You don't pretend very well, Rowan." There was a stillness after that, one that felt alive. I could hear my heart pounding, could see the way his gaze lingered, not searching but remembering. I wanted to move, to say something, but my body refused. The silence stretched, thin and dangerous. And then it happened. He reached out, almost absently, brushing his thumb against my wrist where it rested on the dock. Just that, nothing more. But it felt like the world had stopped breathing. His touch was gentle, careful, as if he were testing the edge of something fragile. My pulse quickened beneath his skin. He must have felt it, because he froze. For a long moment, we stayed like that, neither of us speaking, both of us knowing what that silence meant. Then he pulled his hand back, slow and deliberate. "We should head inside," he said, his voice rougher than before. The walk back to the house was quiet. I could hear the crunch of gravel under our shoes, the rhythmic beat of my own heartbeat in my ears. When we reached the porch, he turned toward me, as if he wanted to say something. But whatever it was, he swallowed it down. "Good night," was all he managed. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in circles. I told myself it was just a moment, a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something real in that touch, something that scared me because it wasn't supposed to exist. Over the next few days, he avoided me. Not obviously, he was still kind, still polite, but distant. He'd disappear for hours, go running early in the mornings, leave notes instead of conversations. It hurt more than I expected it to. I wanted to confront him, to ask why he was pulling away, but the words wouldn't form. When he was around, the tension was unbearable. He'd glance at me and look away too quickly, like my presence was something dangerous. It made me angry, but more than that, it made me sad, because beneath all that restraint, I could still feel it. The quiet pull between us neither of us wanted but couldn't deny. One night, after another long silence over dinner, I finally asked, "Did I do something wrong?" He looked up from his plate, startled. "What?" "No, of course not." "Then why do you keep avoiding me?" I said. My voice was softer than I meant it to be. He sighed, set down his fork, and rubbed the back of his neck. "Because sometimes the right thing feels wrong. And if you don't walk away soon enough, you stop knowing the difference." I didn't understand what he meant then. Not fully. I just knew his words hurt. He stood up, took his plate to the sink, and said quietly, "You'll understand someday." After he went to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the flickering light above the stove. His words kept replaying in my head. I didn't want to understand them. I just wanted things to go back to how they were. Simple, easy, full of quiet laughter and unspoken trust. But some lines, once crossed, never really disappear. That night, as the house settled into silence, I realized something had shifted permanently. Whatever we were before that moment on the dock, we could never be again. And though neither of us said it out loud, we both knew we'd cross a line we could never uncross. A week later, Drew asked if I wanted to drive out to the lake house for the weekend. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he'd practiced the invitation beforehand. I hesitated, but curiosity and something else, something restless, made me agree. He said he wanted to get out of the house for a bit, to clear his head. I didn't know if that meant he wanted to escape me or the silence we had built together. The drive was long and quiet. The world outside the truck window blurred into miles of pine trees and fading sunlight. The air between us felt dense, like it was holding a conversation neither of us could start. Occasionally, he'd point out a landmark or hum along to a song on the radio, but most of the ride was spent in thoughts that never turned into words. When we reached the lake house, It was already late afternoon. The place looked untouched by time, a cabin of weatherwood sitting on the edge of still water, surrounded by tall birch trees that swayed lazily in the wind. Drew unlocked the door, and a familiar smell of dust and lake air filled the room. "I used to come here as a kid," he said, setting down his bag. "Dad would take me fishing every summer." His voice softened on the last word, as though speaking it made something ache inside him. We spent the first few hours cleaning, unpacking, cooking simple food. There was an unspoken agreement not to talk about the past week, not to mention what had happened on the dock or the distance that followed. But every so often, our eyes would meet, and that was enough to bring the silence roaring back. After dinner, we sat outside on the porch. The sky was bruised with twilight, and the lake mirrored every fading color. Drew poured himself a glass of whiskey and offered me one. I declined. He took a slow sip and exhaled, his breath fogging faintly in the cooling air. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "why people always say love is supposed to fix you?" I looked at him, unsure how to answer. He continued, "Sometimes it doesn't fix anything. Sometimes it ruins the parts of you that were fine before." His eyes didn't leave the horizon, but I could tell he wasn't talking about something abstract. "Is that what happened to you?" I asked softly. He smiled faintly, a sad kind of smile. "Yeah, something like that." For a while, we just sat there, listening to the water brushing against the dock. Then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You remind me of someone I used to know, someone I cared about too much." The words hit like a quiet storm. I wanted to ask who, but my throat tightened. I could sense the truth hiding in the spaces between his words. When he finally looked at me, the air shifted. There was no disguise in his expression anymore, no pretense of distance. Just raw, exhausted honesty. "Rowan," he said slowly, as if my name itself was a decision, "you need to know that what I feel, it shouldn't exist. I've tried to ignore it. I've told myself it's nothing, that it'll fade, but..." He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't, and that terrifies me." My chest tightened. The sound of the water seemed louder, the night air colder. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because pretending isn't helping anymore," he said. "And because you deserve to know." The words hung between us, trembling. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Part of me wanted to run, to end the moment before it became something irreversible. But another part, quieter, heavier, wanted to stay. "I don't know what to say." I finally whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "Just know that this isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." But I didn't believe that. Deep down, I knew I wasn't blameless. I had felt the same pull, fed it with every glance, every shared silence. I was complicit in the unspoken. He stood then, walking down to the edge of the porch, staring out at the lake. "When you're older," he said, "you'll understand how love can twist itself into something you can't name. You'll think it's control or desire or confusion, but it's all just fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being alone." I rose slowly, unsure if I was supposed to follow him. The wind carried his words back to me, soft but deliberate. "I can't be that person for you, Rowan, even if part of me wants to be." His voice cracked on the last sentence, and I knew then that whatever existed between us had reached its limit. It wasn't a confession meant to bring us closer. It was one meant to draw the line neither of us had the strength to draw before. I walked to him anyway. We stood side by side, both staring at our reflections in the water. For a long time, neither of us said a word. The world felt too still, as if holding its breath for what would happen next. When I finally spoke, my voice shook. "I never wanted this to be wrong," I said, "but I don't even know what this is anymore." He turned to me, his expression filled with something I couldn't read. "It's human," he said softly. "That's the worst and best thing about it." And then, quietly, he reached out and touched my shoulder, not with desire, not with hesitation, but with sorrow. A touch that said goodbye without using the word. "Go inside," he murmured. "Get some sleep. I'll be out here for a while." I obeyed, though every step toward the door felt like betrayal of him, of myself, of the fragile connection we had nurtured and now had to destroy. Inside, I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the window. The reflection of the porch light flickered across the glass, like a memory, trying to stay alive. Through the window, I could see him sitting by the water, motionless. The moonlight silvered his outline, turning him into a ghost of someone who'd already decided to leave. He looked smaller somehow, or maybe just more human. Hours passed before I finally lay down, but sleep never came. The night stretched on, filled with the sound of water and the ache of what couldn't be undone. When the first light of dawn seeped through the windows, I saw him still sitting there, the same as before, still distant and unreachably sad. I wanted to go to him, to ask him what would happen next, but deep down I already knew. That morning would change everything. The silence that began that night would grow into the ending neither of us could avoid. And though we hadn't said the words, both of us knew. The summer had already become a memory we'd spend the rest of our lives trying not to remember. The weeks that followed felt like walking through fog, dense, confusing, and heavy with unspoken things. I saw my uncle less and less, but every time our paths crossed, there was a quiet tension between us, a weight neither of us dared to name. My parents were back on their trip, and life had technically returned to normal. The house was filled again with noise, laughter, and the comfort routine, but I felt like a stranger inside it, because a part of me now belonged somewhere else, in a memory that refused to fade. One evening, while I was helping my dad with some repairs in the backyard, I noticed my uncle's car pull into the driveway. My heart skipped before I could stop it. He stepped out wearing that same easy confidence he always carried, but his eyes, those calm, familiar eyes, seemed to hold something restless. My dad smiled, welcoming him like always, unaware of the storm brewing beneath that polite exchange. Inside, we sat for dinner like any ordinary family. The sound of forks against plates and the chatter of my mom filled the air, but I couldn't focus. Every word he spoke, every small smile he gave, felt loaded, a reminder of what we'd shared when no one else was around. He laughed at one of my mom's stories, and I found myself watching the way his shoulders moved when he did. Then, just for a second, his gaze met mine, and that small, fleeting glance carried all the unspoken things we hadn't had the courage to face. After dinner, I slipped outside to breathe, to clear my head. The air was cool, the kind that carries the smell of rain before it falls. I heard footsteps behind me, and before I turned, I knew it was him. He stood beside me quietly, looking at the sky, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet sadness. I hesitated before replying. I didn't know what to say. He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I said. I didn't either. He looked at me then, and the calm in his eyes broke into something more human, vulnerable, almost pleading. What happened it shouldn't have. I crossed a line, and I'll carry that. His words hit me like a slow, deep ache. Part of me wanted to run from it, but another part, the part that remembered every stolen look, every word that lingered between us, couldn't. "You didn't force me," I said quietly, trying to find balance in my own confusion. "I let it happen, too." He sighed, shaking his head. "You were too young to understand what you were stepping into. I should have protected you from that. Instead, his voice cracked, and he didn't finish. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt both final and forgiving. I wanted to hate him for making me feel something I wasn't supposed to feel, but I couldn't, because despite everything, I knew it had come from something real. Not lust, not manipulation. Just two lonely hearts finding comfort where they shouldn't have. He took a deep breath and looked out toward the trees. "I'm moving out of state," he said. "Got a job offer in Portland. I think it's best for everyone." The words landed heavy. I want to say something, anything to stop him, but nothing came out. I just stood there, watching a man who had, in ways both wrong and right, changed how I saw love and connection. "I'm not asking you to understand," he continued softly. "But someday, when you're older, maybe you'll look back and see that I care about you more than I ever should have, but never more than you deserved." He smiled faintly, and for a moment, I saw the warmth that had always drawn me in, the gentleness that made it all so confusing. When he left that night, he didn't say goodbye the way people usually do. He just looked at me one last time, as if trying to memorize everything. The quiet, the guilt, the affection, the strange, fragile bond that neither of us would ever fully escape. Then he turned and walked to his car, and I watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. Weeks later, I received a letter from him. No return address, just his handwriting. Inside, he wrote about starting over, about learning to forgive himself, and about hoping I'd find love in a place untouched by pain or confusion. He ended it with, "Sometimes the people who hurt us aren't villains. They're just human beings who fail to love the right way." Reading those words, I felt something inside me loosen. The ache didn't vanish, but it softened. I realized that love, real love, can exist even in broken forms, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to let it end where it must. Now, years later, I don't think of him with anger. I think of him as a part of a chapter one never expected to live, but one that shaped me in ways I can't deny. It taught me that love isn't always clean or easy. Sometimes it's messy, complicated, and full of contradictions, but it's still love. And maybe that's what makes it human. The night he left, I remember standing by my window, staring into the distance where his car had vanished. The world felt quieter, but in that quiet, there was clarity. The story between us had ended, but its echoes would stay with me, shaping how I understood trust, forgiveness, and the kind of love that asked for nothing but truth. And though I never saw him again, part of me hopes he found peace. Because despite everything that happened, in some quiet, hidden corner of my heart, I already had